Yes, this business about bike helmets is one that we've talked about before, and there's been a lot of talk lately, hasn't there, about how far government should intrude in terms of personal freedoms and what our responsibilities are when we get out there and where the two meet. There's a campaign seeking to abolish compulsory bicycle helmet laws, and the state government isn't very happy about it. As you can understand, Brisbane filmmaker Jeff McLeod has applied to have a $40,000 advertisement broadcast on television to change laws requiring all cyclists to wear helmets when riding. His argument is that the laws were responsible for halting what he calls utility bike rides and had contributed to the rising obesity rate. He said that Australia is one of 2% of nations that have this absolutely, in his words, ridiculous law, and says it's the equivalent of telling people who drive cars that they have to gear up like Craig Lowndes, or telling beachgoers they have to wear life jackets or surfers to wear headgear. Well, I don't know if that stands up necessarily, but here's a little bit of his ad. Then I'll talk to a gentleman who's been involved in public safety for a very long time. Just have a listen to, it's a video thing, but I think you'll get a sense of it.
Across the world, cycling is thriving, except in Australia. Because Australia is among only 2% of nations that still impose unnecessary mandatory helmet laws on adult cyclists. And in the years since helmet laws were introduced, Australia's obesity rate has more than doubled to lead the world. Taxpayer-funded public bike schemes have failed, while utility cycling has ceased for an entire generation. With no difference in injury rates, mandatory helmet laws have done more harm than good. Cycling needs a chance to be part of our everyday lives again. End mandatory helmet laws now. Give adult riders the same freedom to choose as they have in the rest of the developed world. Visit helmetfreedom.org and take action.
Yeah, I don't know that he's entirely right in all the facts there, but that's the gist of the argument when he's saying there's no difference in injury rates. My reading of it says there are differences to the injury rates, but a gentleman who will know more is Professor Chris Rissel, Professor of Public Health at the University of Sydney. Chris is an investigator on an Australian Research Council-funded study of cycling risks and hazards, so we'll know more about it than most. Professor, thanks for your time. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning, Greg.
Well, what do you think of this campaign? Any chance of success, and would you support it?
Well, there's a number of points here. I mean, one is that not all levels of the state government are going to be unhappy about this, because certainly there are some with stakes in injury prevention that might be concerned, but there are others with physical activity promotion that would be quite happy to see more people cycling, and if the removal of the legislation gets more people cycling, which there is some reason to suggest that it would, then in fact, the health budget could benefit quite well. So I think it's a complex story, because they're quite right in many of the things that they're saying. And the Brisbane Bikes Hire scheme isn't performing nearly as well as similar schemes in other countries that don't have the helmet legislation. So I think there's something in it, in what they're saying.
Yes, you make the point in one of your papers I've read that with epidemics of diabetes and obesity threatening to bankrupt state health budgets, governments need to broaden their strategies to encourage physical activity. Then that ties into riding bikes. What, though, becomes the balance between injury prevention and the benefits of cycling without a helmet in terms of cutting back, diabetes, obesity, etc.?
Oh, of course. I mean, there is tension. We don't want to increase danger in any way, but we do have to get people moving more than they do. Now, I noticed in the Courier Mail article that there's some figures there quoted, the risks of injuries and the protective value of helmets, but they're really using quite old statistics, and there's been some reviews of the research papers on this matter, and really they're only about 10 to 15% of head injuries can be prevented by the current helmets that we use, because they don't cover the face, they don't cover the neck, they only work for direct impacts. They might even increase the risk of some kinds of brain injury because of this angular acceleration issue and the diffuse axonal injury. So it's not really clear that helmets work as well as we want them to work. And the fact that if we didn't have them, we'd get health gains, means the balance is probably on the side of the physical activity more than it is prevention. And remember, helmets only work if you have a crash. And the actual likelihood, the absolute risk of having a crash is generally quite small, particularly for the utility kind of cycling, going down the shops, going down the street. compared to other forms of cycling like mountain biking or road racing where they're going really fast. So not all cycling's equally dangerous, and mandatory helmet legislation is a fairly blunt instrument to apply to everyone at all times.
Yeah, I don't know whether there's any merit in it, but I heard it put by somebody overseas. I was talking to somebody when we were watching them cycle into town there in Amsterdam. I think they ride in hundreds of thousands every day. They've got parking stations full of bikes. Bikes, of course, have the right of way there, and I guess by weight of mass, they've got a lot more clout as well. But there was somebody mounting an argument saying, if you have a helmet on, there's a greater risk of crashes because you're thinking more along those lines, and people probably less concerned about you than they otherwise would be. Does that make sense or not?
There is some research that supports this idea of risk compensation, and people are comfortable with a certain level of risk, and if you increase their perception of safety by putting on a helmet, and people do feel safer when they wear a helmet, and then they ride faster, which sort of takes away any benefits that they might have got. And there's some research in the Netherlands where they've actually shown that people ride faster when they put on a helmet, and when people don't wear helmets in England, for example, they've had research that shows that drivers actually treat them more like people rather than a uniformed object. So the guys who wear helmets and lycra and the whole uniform, they become an object rather than a person that they can engage with and make eye contact with, and it's a different road interaction.
How does that tie in, Chris, with a place like Brisbane, which is really not bike friendly? They're trying to make it more so with designated areas for bikes alone, but by and large they're riding our main roads. There's not much room there. So how do you tie in no helmets and roads that really aren't built for cyclists?
And this is a global issue. It's not specific to just Brisbane, although, looking at Brisbane, there's been some big improvements in creating space separated from cars, and I visit Brisbane regularly and I've seen it improve. But other cities around the world are also grappling with this problem. And for New York, for example, they're introducing bike lanes. They don't have bike helmet legislation. Their rates of cycling are going up. Other cities, similarly congested, packed places that with heaps of traffic, but the cars aren't going all that fast always. And so the idea that you could actually have a person on a bicycle without a helmet is very common in the rest of the world. And so I don't know why Australians think that there's somehow something special going on in Australian traffic versus traffic in other parts of the world.
Just on that, what is the history of that? When did all this come in and why?
The legislation was introduced in 1991, and it was introduced in all states over the next year or two. It was introduced as point number 10 on a package of road safety funding, and it was Commonwealth funding to the states, and it was added on at the end, and everyone had to agree to it in order to get the funding for all the other road infrastructure projects that was there. So it was sort of slipped in a way. And since then, of course, only New Zealand has kind of copied, and the rest of the world looked at us. And I say this quite seriously, that some other countries look at Australia and say, well, that's an example of how not to promote cycling.
Is that right? What about children? Would your reasoning apply to them as well, or should the little ones have helmets?
No, there is a case for children having helmets because children are still learning. They do fall off. They will hit their heads. And so there's certainly a case. 60% of injuries in New South Wales that are cycling related are amongst children 16 years and younger. So children are crashing, but it used to be a rite of passage. People used to fall off their bike and learn, and they'd get on with it. But okay, I accept that parents will wish to protect the children. Now, so there's a case for it, and I wouldn't like to say that you shouldn't have it. But once you get to 18, it might be a matter of choice at that point.
Okay, it's an interesting debate. It's good to talk to you this morning. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Professor Chris Rissel. Chris is the Professor of Public Health at the University of Sydney and was an investigator on an Australian Research Council-funded study of cycling risks and hazards, and comes down on the side you just heard him outline. Keen to hear your thoughts. It is something we've touched on, but very keen to hear your thoughts. 13 32. One, there's the right to choose argument and whether you should be compelled to wear a helmet. I mean, we are compelled to wear seatbelts, and that brought about one of the biggest drops in tragedies on the roads and accidents that really maimed and killed people. Do helmets necessarily fit into that same criteria? And should you have the right to choose? 13 32 it is. We'll get into some of your calls on that and anything else you'd like to touch on.